Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to kick around with you some of the key events of life's history on the planet Earth. That's right. How do you like that for a kind of a daunting proposition? I mean, it's pretty difficult if you were to think about it in your own life. If you think about the key events that happened in your life within just the last year, it would be a little bit difficult to recollect, or maybe not. But I'm going to try to go back to the beginning. I mean, and take a look at life on Earth. And we think that it originated somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago. I mean, we have fossil evidence of 3.5 billion years ago, but it might have occurred even earlier still. Now, you might be familiar with the fact that the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, so obviously life had to occur after that. But we figured that the Earth wasn't really the best suitable environment for life as we may know it today, because for the first few 100 million years, the Earth was really being bombarded by some of the rock bodies, if you will, meteors that were flying around from the origin of the solar system. And so it would have been unlikely for life to be able to survive those kind of brutal conditions. But then life came into being, and then you ready for this? And I hope that this is one of the more important takeaways from the video of important events in life's history on the planet. You ready for this? Three quarters, that's 75% of evolutionary history, 75%, the Earth was inhabited just by microscopic prokaryote organisms, unicellular. And so, wow, talk about how these organisms have been not only the beginning of life on the Earth, but they've been sort of with us since then and continue to dominate even today. We know that because some of the earliest fossils, and this is a picture of one down here, this is pretty awesome right here, was this one comes from Western Australia, but 3.5 billion years ago. Pretty impressive. It sort of implies and resembles a bacteria. And so that probably means that life originated a little even sooner than that, like earlier than that, like 3.9 billion years ago. And we sort of suspect that because that's when the Earth began to cool significantly to a point where liquid water could exist. And so prokaryotes, again, have dominated the evolutionary history from on the planet Earth, but especially between the beginning, 3.5 billion to 2 billion years ago. And so this supports that domination, that they were the first earliest forms of life on the planet Earth. And those first cells differentiated and diverged into what we now know as the bacteria domain and the archaea domain. And so, and then you can see how archaea had a common ancestry with the eukaryotic domain, which we are a part of in the animal kingdom, that sort of thing. So we see that these organisms thrive even today, and so they've been with us from the beginning. So what evidence do we have? Some of the richest sources of evidence for these prokaryotic fossils come from stromatolites. And these are layers and layers, like welcome mats, layers and layers of microbial fossil layers, and so stromatolites. And so we even have some stromatolites today. We could see these layers and layers, if you were to cut this open, layers and layer of prokaryotes. And so another key event in life's history is the accumulation of oxygen, first in the ocean and then in the atmosphere around 2.7 billion years ago. Again, these are just the more important, significant events. And so photosynthesis probably evolved pretty early on in prokaryotic history. The ability to capture sunlight, to produce sugars, to then convert water into oxygen. And so that oxygen, the diatomic gas, fills the ocean and then ultimately rises up into the atmosphere. Now, why is that significant? I think you may know this, but I'll cover it. The first type of prokaryotic photosynthetic organisms might have been something like cyanobacteria. In other words, blue-green algae, as it's sometimes commonly known, but it's a bacteria. And that it splits water, as I mentioned, into oxygen, and this evolved around 2.5 billion years ago. And so the importance of this is profound because, again, as more and more oxygen dissolved into the ocean, again, iron would react with this as it does today, forming iron oxides. And so at first the oceans of the world may have been colored a little bit rusty, and then ultimately that copious amount of oxygen would then accumulate into the atmosphere around 2.5, 2.7 billion years ago. It even reacts with the oxygen, again, in the rock, giving the red rock appearance that you see. And so the accumulation of oxygen was gradual at first, but then it shoots up to about 10% of its current value today, which is about 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. And so at first, oxygen had kind of a corrosive effect, and it was kind of deleterious, dooming a lot of the prokaryotes that we believe grew up in an anaerobic environment. And so some species that were able to handle that, thrived, but some species had to avoid it. And so there are still bacteria today, prokaryotes, that remain anaerobic, and that they die in a high concentration of oxygen. That's kind of interesting. But the ones that remained, the ones that liked oxygen, used it. They harnessed it, and they allowed it to be able to react with organic molecules and sugars to produce the maximum energy yield, the oxidation of organic molecules. So it was a big event. And so another huge event is the beginning of eukaryotic life. And again, eukaryotic life is sort of defined by possessing a membrane-bound nucleus. And not only that, but having membrane-bound organelles inside. And so this occurred, again, I'm gonna, not facetiously, but pretty recently, 2.5 billion years ago, the first eukaryotic life. Okay, and so they're generally larger. A prokaryote would be about this size and more complex. And so what gives it their complexity? Well, they have membrane-bound organelles, for example, like you can see in this transmission electron micrograph of mitochondria. And so the appearance of these organelles is partly due, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit more in a moment, but this endo, meaning on the inside, symbiotic prokaryotic idea, that the eukaryotic organisms that we know today with their mitochondria and chloroplasts may have evolved from free-living prokaryotic organisms that became permanent residents inside the cytoplasm. And so that's pretty awesome. And so this is known as the endosymbiotic or symbiotic theory, meaning that today's mitochondria and chloroplasts, is a picture of chloroplasts here, were formerly small prokaryotes living within the host cell. And it became advantageous for it to stay. And so it was mutually beneficial. And so, this places the earliest eukaryotic fossils around the time of the oxygen revolution that changed the Earth's atmosphere and environment so dramatically. And so perhaps it was the evolution of the chloroplast itself that becomes part of the explanation, because it's sort of temporally correlated. Okay, and so I like to think of this idea as the fact that these mitochondria and chloroplasts, came in and they enjoyed it so much, sort of like an au pair. An au pair comes into your house and they stay. Maybe they get a reduced rent, but they're able to do some things around the house, and so it's mutually beneficial. And so what happens is when a mitochondria comes into your cell, you're then better able to, again, utilize that oxygen and burn sugars through aerobic cellular respiration and get a lot of production of ATP. And so that's really important to have. And so the prokaryotic ancestors of the mitochondria and the plastids, such as chloroplasts, may have come in and sort of undigested prey, and they became sort of like parasites. They came in this way, if you will. They came in and they were engulfed, and then they become, internal parasites, and then eventually becoming more and more interdependent, and then becoming maybe part of the single organism. Yeah? So it's kind of interesting. So if I could sort of walk you through that perhaps the plasma membrane, here's a prokaryotic ancestral organism. Maybe the plasma membrane invaginates into what we now know as the nuclear envelope, forming then, again, inside membranes or networks called endoplasmic reticulum, or inside liquid network. And then ultimately, if a mitochondria becomes incorporated, this cell becomes pretty good at cell respiration. So this might be the ancestral heterotrophic eukaryote, like for example us. And then a photosynthetic prokaryote, again, may have engulfed a chloroplast, or a precursor of a chloroplast, an autotrophic prokaryote in some way. Not quite today's modern day chloroplast, but then as you get the point, it might be the ancestral form of a modern day autotroph. And so what is the evidence to support this endosymbiotic theory? They're quite significant, and I want you to make sure that you appreciate these, that the inner membrane, the inner membrane is similar in the mitochondrial membrane and chloroplast membrane to plasma membranes of prokaryotes. So that's the outer membrane. So that's strong evidence. The division of mitochondria and chloroplasts are autonomous, and they're very similar binary fission to some prokaryotes today. Again, very compelling. This one is another important one too, that the organelles themselves, chloroplasts and mitochondria, they can transcribe and translate their own DNA. So they possess their own DNA. So the mitochondria possesses, this is the inner membrane, possesses its own rings of mitochondrial DNA, and they have their own ribosomes. And so they can then translate the protein for itself. So that's not controlled by the nuclear genome in a eukaryotic cell. And then when you break down the ribosomal makeup of a mitochondria and a chloroplast, those are more similar to prokaryotic ribosomes than they are to the eukaryotic ribosome. Isn't that interesting? So the ribosomes of a mitochondria are more similar to bacteria than they are to the cell itself, eukaryotic cells' ribosomes. And so that's pretty strong evidence. Okay, another key evolutionary life history event is the invention of multicellular. You can imagine, again, this is sort of like society, where you have differentiation. You have firefighters, you have policemen, you have government, you have teachers and lawyers, you have all of this specialization, and then collectively, each of these cells works together and therefore is able to accomplish more. So you get specialization. Multicellular eukaryotes evolved fairly recently, 1.5 billion years ago. And so a great range, the understatement, of eukaryotic unicellular forms have evolved from those first days to the present. So multicellular, really important invention because it causes differentiation. And so from that single cell precursor about 1.5 billion years ago as fossils, maybe this came around, again, as I mentioned, 1.5 billion years ago, according to molecular clock estimates. So the invention of multicellular. Now, a major event occurred physically on the Earth somewhere around 750 to 770 million years ago. And it might have been responsible for the limited diversity of multicellular eukaryotes. We have evidence to suggest in the geological record that the Earth was almost completely frozen. Even at the poles, in somewheres, some places, it would have eventually melted, during what is the very late Precambrian time. And so the snowball Earth eventually started to warm up. And maybe at that time, life would have only been found down in the depths of the ocean where the deep sea vents are, the thermal vents. Or maybe they would have been limited to where life could, where sunlight can penetrate, where the ice was pretty thin. And so once the Earth started to melt, there comes the first major distribution of multicellular eukaryotes. And that corresponds to sort of the thawing of the snowball Earth. Okay? Now, again, this is, just a brief, I feel like I have to apologize. It's such a brief look at life's history of the Earth. And so during the early Cambrian period, there was a big radiation of animal diversity, an explosion, the Cambrian explosion, sometimes it's referred to. And so a big radiation of eukaryotic forms occurred right at the beginning of the Cambrian period. And still today, some of the major groups of animals exist as a result of that. Things like jellyfish and phylum Cnidaria and the porifera, the sponges. These are present already, but this Cambrian explosion basically created a lot of fossils and created a lot of animal phyla that are present today. Sponges, again, cnidarians and mollusks, they in the fossil record during this Cambrian explosion, we can also see evidence of the first real predator-prey interactions. Amazing that this is found in the fossil record. And again, things like the sponges and the echinoderms and the annelids and arthropods, these are all starting to appear in the early Cambrian period, in the first 20 million years. Another key major event of life on the Earth is the colonization. Now, before that, everything that we've been talking about has occurred in the ocean. Now we're colonizing the land for the first time. It's a pretty big milestone. So of course I don't have a picture of that, but this is a picture of Mars. Kind of reminds me of what life or the Earth might have been on land, which is pretty much lifeless. Okay, and so the first colonization of land. And so as you might anticipate, you can't imagine that animals would be the very first organisms there, because again, they need part of the food chain. They need plants to eat. And so the first colonization of land was probably, again, like the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, other photosynthetic prokaryotes. And again, this was, you needed the rock needed to be pretty damp, and there's fossil evidence suggesting this, that plants and fungi, again, and then animals, about 500 million years ago, fairly recent. The microscopic life that came on didn't colonize the land again until 500 million years ago. And I put in this cartoon's one of my favorites. The reason why the fish came onto the land, because they were retrieving their baseball. Pretty cool. And so this gradual evolution from water to land required some major adaptations to prevent the dehydration and also to be able to reproduce on land. So these are some of the issues on land. Of course, there's some benefits, a little more light, more carbon dioxide, these kinds of things, again, more atmospheric oxygen. However, things like plants that would dry out unless they started having like waterproof leaves or wax on their leaves to reduce transpirational losses. But more importantly than that, one of the major associations that plants had that allowed them to make the leap onto the land was their relationship with fungi. Fungi are so good with their extending into the soil with their hyphae and mycelium, and they're able to gather all of these nutrients which enhance the plant's roots. And so these fungi live in the roots of the plants symbiotically, giving the plant a chance to get even more water and nutrient. And as payment, the plant's able to photosynthesize and provide some sugars for the fungi to live. And so this ancient, and it's still happening today, association that plants have with fungi called mycorrhizome or mycorrhizae. That's kind of a powerful word. There's fossil evidence of showing this relationship. So that's pretty awesome that with this relationship between plant roots and fungi have been going on for a long time. And so plants then, when they're on the land, create new opportunities for all of life. So herbivores, plant-eating animals, and then their predators, and you can see how life kind of bootstraps itself up onto the land this way, if you can imagine. And then again, great terrestrial animals, arthropods, and like early insects and spiders. And then again, you start getting into amphibians that go back into the water to lay their eggs, and then reptiles that start to lay their eggs on the land where there wouldn't be as many predators, but yet can go back into the water but live mostly on the land. Birds, and then mammals. And so the orders of modern mammals, including primates, which we're a member of, is 50 to 60 million years ago, not very long. And so you could see here, it's a little humor there, the humans have diverged from other primates only 5 million years ago. 5 million years ago. How about that? And just this branch right there, 5 million years is our field of anthropology, the story of human evolution. Pretty awesome. I welcome you to take a look at that. But you get these awesome terrestrial vertebrates, backbone, the tetrapods, 4 feet, and they're walking along. And there's fossil evidence of this. Evolved from fish. And again, there's connection there based on the fossil record. And then they evolved from the amphibian, and then birds, and then mammals evolved ultimately from these reptiles. Pretty awesome. And then again, you could sort of, use this graph and look at that, the origin of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago, or 4,600 million years ago. Again, earliest fossils of eukaryotic cells, the diversification of vascular plants, important to draw water higher up so you can have more branching and more leaves. You can then, the radiation of reptiles fairly recently, as we were just discussing. And then ultimately, the disappearance of the dinosaurs, flowering plants, the origin of major primate groups, and then just most recently, the appearance of man, and just in a blink of the eye. And so it's quite remarkable, and I want to end with this, that it's pretty incredible that the human animal, it has reached a level of intelligence so that it can actually explore its own origin. It can actually investigate its descendants and see how it appeared on the planet Earth. Pretty cool. I don't think the other animals are capable of that, so it's somewhat unique. And so I hope you enjoyed this brief look at the key events in life history. Thanks for watching.